All right, welcome back, everyone. Tonight, we are continuing with our discussion of Platonic dialogues, but today we're going to do something a little bit different. And I want to essentially juxtapose what we've been looking at in Plato with another super interesting philosopher of the same period, Epicurus. And the reason I wanted to do that, well, I guess they're in the kind of from the Aristotelian four causes perspective, the immediate or the effective cause was that I was actually reading Diogenes Laertius for another book club that I'm part of. And as I was studying and reading book 10 of that, which is specifically centered on Epicureanism and Epicurus, the life of Epicurus, it dawned on me that it would be great to put these two thinkers side by side, so Plato and Epicurus. And here's why. If you were looking for something as far removed from Plato as possible, I don't know that you can do better than Epicurus. And sometimes it helps to understand one thinker when you are contrasting his thoughts and his system of beliefs with another. So what I want to do today is uh, essentially go down line point by point of Plato versus Epicurus on different topics. And we can sort of compare and contrast how they think about things and why. And maybe that will have some value in terms of understanding both of them, or Plato primarily, but really even more, just put Plato in a little bit more context, because he's obviously not the only one in the marketplace of ideas at that time, as we'll discover shortly. So that's the outline. What I'm going to do is I'll speak for a little bit about kind of the main points of Epicureanism as a teaching, and then I'll open it up to you to contribute and ask questions, and let's see if we can muster a interesting discussion on these points. So Epicurus lived roughly around the same time as Plato and Aristotle. Um, the dates are a little bit unclear. It's the 4th century BC, but obviously the thinking of Plato and Epicurus kind of, again, coincides in terms of kind of the general historical context. And so they were both aware, or at least we know that Plato was aware of the Cynics. He was aware of the skeptics. And Epicureanism perhaps did not originate as Plato was developing his view of the ideas, but definitely on the other side, Epicurus was certainly aware of the Platonic teaching. And so a lot of his thinking is a reaction to the Platonic school of thought. So with that, just very briefly, I want to mention that Epicurus himself was a disciple of several philosophers, perhaps the most notable of which is Democritus. Democritus, of course, is famous for postulating the theory of atoms, these indivisible particles that everything is made from. And we still use this terminology in modern physics, even though we now believe that atoms are divisible. They are composed of smaller particles. And it seems like it's turtles all the way down in one way. Every time we say, okay, well, now it's protons and neutrons. Well, wait, now it's not protons. It's these other smaller particles that protons and neutrons are made of, and so on and so on. So Democritus definitely exercised notable influence on Epicurus. And at one point, Epicurus essentially founded the school after he formulated his ideas. He was a prolific writer. Unfortunately, I don't think we have really any of his writings in remaining extant, but we find it in quotes from different authors. One of the better ones that is preserved is this book of Diogenes Laertius, who describes lives of eminent philosophers, and he quotes their teaching. And so in this book, we have several letters, presumably written by Epicurus to some of his disciples, in which he expounds his teaching and formulates kind of the main points of his teaching. So what I want to do is basically just go down the list and start from the very basic idea of what is true and what is false. And if you remember, as we were going down going through different Platonic dialogues, it's pretty apparent what Plato's position on this is, right? Plato is saying that there are two types of things in this world: things that are changeable, that are perceived by our senses primarily, and then there are things that are eternal, that are perceived by our reason. And the eternal things are really the true things, the lasting things, the fundamental things of reality. But the changing things are fleeting and incidental, essentially. And so in order for us to really grasp the nature of reality, the fundamental questions of reality, we cannot use our senses because they will deceive us. And from there, you get into this idea of forms or ideas in Greek, and off we go. So you're familiar with that. I think we've spent a lot of time on that. Now, what does Epicurus say? Well, Epicurus says the opposite. It says the only things that are reliable are things that are perceived by our senses. This is such a interesting departure. I mean, such a stark departure from Plato that if you're like me and you've been reading Plato for a while, it really is. I mean, the first time you read this, it kind of shocks you in how completely opposite it is to what Plato was saying. And then Epicurus goes on to say that, in fact, not only senses are the only true way to perceive the world as it is, our problem and the source of our problem is all the theorizing that we do about things that we do not see with our senses. And so all of our mistaken notions are, in fact, the result of our opinions. This is where Plato and Epicurus actually agree, because Socrates or Plato also say that opinions can be true or false. And really, we don't need opinions. We need kind of first principles that go back to these forms. But Epicurus says that opinions are kind of disconnected from the perceptions, from the senses. They are interpretations of what we see, of what we experience with our senses. So this is where he says, okay, this is how everything starts off, starts going towards the wrong path, is because we are taking our perceptions and then trying to interpret something instead of taking them at face value. So that's point number one. Of course, then he goes on to this very interesting, Epicurus that is, goes on to this very interesting theory of what it is that we're actually sensing. Again, the very first, if you've never read this, I really do recommend you read Diogenes Laertius, book 10. Again, it's such an interesting way of thinking or looking at the world. Not necessarily correct, but just the idea itself. And here's how it goes. So he doesn't say it, but that's my kind of way of simplifying it and interpreting it. You know, like how we perceive smell, sense, right? We smell certain things. And what is it that we smell? Well, we know now in more detail, chemically, it's these chemicals that are in the air, right? And they are emanating from the object, whatever it is that we're smelling, right? So it's basically parts of that thing that we're observing with our sense of smell, and these particles are interacting with our nose, right, and with the nervous endings in our nose. And that's how we sense scent. Now, Epicurus took that idea as a general way that we interact with the world. He said, not only is this true of smell, but this is true of eyesight and hearing and touch, and basically every way that we perceive immediate perception of the world it has to do with some sort of emanation of the object that we are interacting with. So for eyesight, what is it that we're interacting with? Well, he said that, like Democritus, who postulated that everything is made of atoms, Epicurus says that yes, everything is made of atoms, and in fact, everything in the world of material nature, which is, by the way, the only things that are material. They're made of atoms. There's nothing. There's whatever is material in nature. So it is composed of these indivisible particles, atoms, which are in constant motion, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But everything that we experience is an immediate interaction with particles that are made of these atoms. Now, the atoms themselves are below the threshold of our perception, but particles that are made of atoms, even though they're very small, we can perceive. And so, for instance, when we're seeing something, according to Epicurus, we're actually detecting or interacting with there are different translations, but one translation calls it filaments, or these little images that are essentially effused from everything. And they're very, very tiny, and they're very, very fast. And so our eyes are constantly interacting with like these little particles that are hitting us. But these particles are not like we would think today as like reflections of light. These are actually the things that we're looking at. So if I'm seeing, I don't know, a computer screen, or maybe better example, a tree or anything, what I'm actually detecting in my eye are little particles of this tree or the sun or whatever piece, blade of grass, anything that I'm seeing, these little, very, very thin filaments are coming straight at me, and they're interacting with my eye, and they're then triggering a particular sensation that then is processed by my reason, right? I can then, the mind detects it, and then it forms some sort of idea of what that is, of what I'm seeing. So that was his very ingenious way of completely bypassing this world of ideas, world of what Plato would call the real, right, versus the shadow. There is no shadow, according to Epicurus. It's only the material things, only the things that are made of these little particles, atoms, he calls them, right? According to Democritus, whose teaching he espoused in that regard. And so, therefore, that's all there is to the universe. Anything else that is not material, that is not based on atoms, is not real. So that was point number two. Now, what about the soul? Right. So Plato, of course, if you remember, we read Timaeus, we read some of the other dialogues where he talks about that the nature of the soul is eternal, and that's our connection to the world of the ideal is our soul. Epicurus says no, soul is actually also made of atoms, and so it's just atoms that are very, very fine. So atoms come in, according to Epicurus, atoms come in different sizes. And there's a finite number of the different sizes, and there's an infinite number of atoms. So almost like when you read it, it almost sounds like different chemical elements, right? So depending on the size, you have a different chemical element. Epicurus is almost there. So he thinks that atoms they come in different sizes, and they also come in different shapes, a finite number of those. And they're also, they have discrete sizes. So he espoused the idea of quanta, right? Just like we have quantum physics today, which says that there are certain indivisible units of length, for instance, right? That an atom or an electron can traverse. It can't traverse smaller distances. It can jump from like one orbit to another orbital in an atom. The same idea, Epicurus says that atoms are they come in quantum sizes, right? That have a particular quantum number, if you will, right? So they're made up of like 3 atomic sizes or 5 atomic sizes or 6 atomic sizes. These sizes are never one. So an atom will always have more than um, the size of an atom will always be greater than this minuscule minimum size that is allowed in the universe. And the reason for that is he has to explain how atoms can um, touch each other or be in proximity to each other without completely overlapping, right? Because if each atom has this quantum size of 1, then you can either be not touching or then completely overlapping. And that creates problems for kind of the makeup of the world, which doesn't work like that, right? We have sort of like continuity, and we have things that are completely apart or together, and then like you need to explain how that actually works. So those were his ideas about atoms and the connection with the soul. All right, so okay, let me just look at my notes here. Right, so the other part is his idea about what really makes up the universe. So the universe is made up of really just 2 things. It's made up of things, which are made up of atoms, and it's also made up of space. Now, what is space according to Epicurus? In his mind, space is actually just a place where things are. So it's not a thing in itself, which of course is different in how we perceive or understand the universe today. To us, universe, at least the modern physics interpretation of the universe, is that there's a space-time continuum, and space is not a discrete thing. In fact, space kind of interacts with material bodies, and it can be bent by material bodies and so on. So Epicurus, of course, didn't know anything about that. And in his mind, space is just nothing. But it's not nothing like a vacuum, well, or like it has some materiality because it provides a space for the atoms to be in. And most of the universe is space. The universe is infinite, according to Epicurus, and there's an infinity of the worlds. Just like Giordano Bruno theorized, there's infinite number of worlds. If you remember, Plato actually said, no, there's not an infinite number of worlds, there's only one universe. One universe, and it kind of makes sense because if you start with this sort of idealized world of the idealized view of the world as being one, and it's kind of a reflection of the eternal being, then how can it be infinite, right? You have to have, I mean, you can have infinite number of planets maybe or something like that, but not infinite number of worlds. And Epicurus, of course, says, no, there is no such thing as a reflection of some other deeper reality. It's just like you have atoms, they're floating. They're not floating really, they're moving actually, almost like falling. And they're interacting as they're moving at different speeds. They're interacting and forming different bodies that are then perceived by our senses. So all the things that we perceive, it's all atomically based. And again, the perceptions are based on these filaments that are constantly moving towards us and interacting with us in different ways. Here is another interesting idea there. He says that if you have, let's say, an animal, and that animal at some point is deceased, that animal has been emanating these things prior to its demise. And those things are still kind of floating around. And so they could be perceived by us even after the disappearance of the source object, right? So he thinks that myths and all these different stories about the gods and unicorns and centaurs and so on are simply remains of these filaments of things that no longer exist, and these filaments apparently, like, they are colliding with each other and creating false impressions that are then processed by our reasoning correctly. We fail to differentiate um, things that should be differentiated, right? So like, oh, a horse and a human being. Well, that's a centaur. Instead of saying, no, no, that's a horse that perhaps no longer exists, and here's a human being that no longer exists, so let's put those separately. We have these filaments coming at us, and they are combined, and they're sort of like overlaid one on top of the other. So very ingenious ways of explaining mythology and kind of the world of the fantastical, right? Of course, a Plato would say, no, it's centaurs probably, there's some deeper meaning there and so on. Oh, another word is lamina. That's another translation I've seen, lamina, for these emanations. So filaments or laminas. Uh, okay. All right, so that's the physical side of things. Now, the soul, of course, is also, like I mentioned, soul is made up of very fine atoms, specifically very small atoms, very fast, and therefore everything in our kind of experience as human beings that has to do with our souls is simply a motion of atoms. So our desires, our reason, everything really, it's just motion of these really, really fine atoms. And logically, that it would follow that once the body disintegrates, the body is like a carcass for this very fine soul material. Once the body, which is like a sheath or a platform for this, or like I guess, a base for this soul matter, once that disintegrates, the soul is gone. So there is no eternal soul, according to Epicurus. The soul is very much mortal, just like our bodies. And therefore, according to him, this should free us up from all sorts of inhibitions and all sorts of fears of death, specifically, which to him is the greatest threat to the peace of mind. And so this is where we have the connection from his theory of physics to his theory of ethics. Just like actually Plato, this is where the two are in agreement. Both of them base their ethics and morals on their underlying theory of physics and ontology. And so to Epicurus, the connection is such that, well, if in fact the world is fully material and we're not eternal, and we cease to exist, and there's no punishment after death, there's no eternal soul, there's no torment, there's nothing like that, then we should not fear death, because it's a very, it happens very fast, or even if it doesn't, it's a limit, it's a finite experience, and after that there is nothing to fear, nothing to experience, nothing to be tormented about. Therefore, we can just focus on kind of maximizing our enjoyment of life today. And of course, why should we do that? Well, because our senses are there to guide us towards reality, if you remember. And the senses will tell us if something is pleasant, that means it's good. It's very simple. You want to know what's good? Just follow your senses. If it feels good, then it's the right thing to do. If it feels bad, then it's the wrong thing to do. Now, a lot of people have misinterpreted this, and I think Epicurus actually addresses it. He says it doesn't mean that I'm advocating for a life of uncontrolled revelry and sort of being given over to different appetites. In fact, it's the opposite, because the primary driver and the motive of life is to avoid, it's not so much pursuing pleasurable experiences. It's first of all avoiding the unpleasant ones, right? So if you can do that, if you can avoid the unpleasantries of life, you've pretty much reached, you're 90% there. The other 10% is just experiencing the pleasures. But what are the pleasures? Well, it's the necessary things in life, right? Like the food, sex, shelter, and so on. But the other part of it is what he considers friendship to be a huge part of what makes life pleasant and meaningful. And I find that very practical and kind of really endearing in a lot of ways. Whereas Plato, it's all about focusing on the politics and how to make a perfect city and a perfect state, and it's all kind of outward. Epicurus says, no, no, you need to just make sure you have good relationships with people that are close to you and important to you, your friends, and everything else will kind of take care of itself. So that's his, again, a point of departure from Plato and from Socrates, who are, again, all about a life of service, a life of public contribution, and so on. So I think these are pretty much the high points. And then I'll stop here, and I want to just ask you what you think about this and what your take on Epicurus is after kind of hearing the summary, and if you have anything to add, perhaps, or comment.
Yeah, okay. Right for the wrong reasons. As so many philosophers are.
Right,
Yeah.
for the wrong reasons.
Well, his line, and like I said, I was 8 when I was reading this, right? So I was of an 8-year-old mindset. But yeah, death, therefore, the most awful of evils, is nothing to us, seeing that when we are, death is not, or it is not come, and when death is come, we are not. It is nothing then, either to the living or to the dead. And I remember reading that, I thought, actually, that makes a lot of sense. Now, the fact that he got it from this bizarre uh, pre-photon view of the world, that the actual, as you say, the actual bit of filament of grass or the filament of dead animal, right, is actually hitting us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can't remember if I read that at 8 or, I mean, I just might have read the bit. I just thought, oh, that's good. Yeah, I agree with that. That actually makes sense. And probably the reasoning
Mm-hmm.
at 8 years old, you don't look at that kind of stuff. Right? So yeah, right, I say right for the wrong reasons.
Right. Okay. No, yeah, I see. I see. What about you, Katie? Any thoughts on Epicurus versus Plato? Who's right? Who's wrong?
Well, we have this idea of like where you said atoms, right? That now we see them not as so you're saying atoms. I'm trying to map it onto like the modern understanding. Now we kind of see them as like signals or something like that between and what survive. So I'm sorry, can you repeat a little bit the atoms and what's surviving
Right.
after?
Right. So it really, I mean, it's just a not when you think about it, it's really just a difference in nomenclature. What we call atoms today and what he called atoms are two different things. But if you think of just in terms of like fundamental particles that make up the universe, I think he was pretty much spot on. Now, he had some different ideas about, or some erroneous ideas about things like um, how we perceive the world, right? From like how the light works and how hearing works and so on. But uh, the way he connected material things like atoms to the soul, I mean, a lot of people today would say, yeah, that's exactly right. Our minds, what we experience, right? Our personality, whatever you want to call soul, is fundamentally a result of material particles interacting. Now he said, well, soul though specifically is a thing, right? So it's not just a like we would think, okay, we have a brain and we have some kind of neuronal activity. He didn't think that at all. He said soul is actually located, I think, in the chest or in the kind of like the belly region, because you can kind of feel the warmth of when you have a particular feeling, you feel it right here. You don't feel it in the head. So obviously soul has got to be somewhere like here in the center. Uh, and it's made of these even tinier atoms that are moving very, very fast. And why do they need to be moving very fast? Well, because of how fast thought is, right? We think really fast. As light, as we interact with the world, all of our thinking is like super fast compared to the phenomena we actually observe. So that's why you need to have these small atoms that are kind of percolating and creating the phenomena that we associate with our mind or our emotions and so on. And then he made the following connection. Okay, so since that's the case, and soul is material, and it is in fact encased in the body, like the body is essentially like a platform for it that sheeds it from, the elements, the external elements. If that body disintegrates, the soul itself will also disintegrate. Because it doesn't have independent existence. It's dependent on the body to kind of provide that infrastructure, if you will.
It's a material thing itself, then.
Yeah, yeah. So that was his thinking. Very different from Plato, of course. Plato says soul is eternal. That's the only connection we have to the eternal world. It's modeled on the eternal mind of the creator, right? And that's why we can perceive beauty. That's why we can perceive all these, ideal things, is precisely because soul is this eternal something that's stuck in our material frame. So
we're left asking, who is the more wrong? It's kind of not coming from a philosophical background. You come across these themes and then you discover how old they are, right? And you think, oh, okay, so these philosophers are all building on each other. With probably a false assumption right at the start. So when I would like read Heidegger and he's talking about death, right? And then you go back to Epicurus 2,500 years earlier, and you just think, wow, okay, I can see where this is coming from. Likewise, when you think of existence versus essence. So you got Epicurus on the existence side, and you got, I mean, not exactly, but you see how these sort of ideas have modified themselves over the centuries, right? Materialism, empiricism. Okay, well done, Epicurus. You're getting there, right? Versus idealism, Plato, right? So all these sort of dichotomies of opposites, right? You can see their origins in things like this, and you can see how they've evolved over time. But you don't come from a philosophical background like me, and you think, well, okay, you're all wrong because we know now, right? Because we've got modern ways of understanding it. So it's always very peculiar to look back and just think, okay, so they were right for the wrong reasons or wrong for the right reasons, or whatever. Yeah.
No, yeah, it's a thorny path, right, towards grasping reality. And who's to say that our ideas are not going to change very radically in another 50 or 100 years? Probably not, but again, never know. I mean, people thought Newtonian view of the cosmos was pretty much the final word in science, and then Einstein comes along and completely upends that whole framework pretty much. And
right. I don't think
people
we're going to go back to Plato's realms, though, are we?
yeah. And people, by the way, people thought the universe was infinite all the way up until the ideas of the Hubble telescope and this idea of the Big Bang, which was an early 20th century hypothesis, right? Until that was proposed and verified, or at least we think it's verified, and you can kind of extrapolate backwards. Everybody thought the universe was in fact infinite and eternal, not just infinite, but eternal. Nobody thought that the universe had a beginning. It's very interesting that a materialist like Epicurus was more wrong than idealist Plato as far as the universe not being an eternal thing. Both Plato and the modern physicists would agree that the universe has a beginning, probably has an end, according to Plato too, and according to physics, probably has some sort of heat death or something like that. So
Actually, that's
anyway,
still an open debate as to whether the universe had a beginning.
right?
So,
Well, perhaps, yeah, perhaps, yeah. So I'm saying like it's an interesting way to, but super interesting also to observe how they were connecting their view of the world to the ethics. And today we don't tend to think along those lines. We tend to separate physical sciences are over here, and then you have social sciences over there, and the two are kind of never the twain shall meet.
When was the break? Yeah, because you're more schooled in these things than I. So can you pinpoint a century or a particular school of thought where people started separating non-overlapping magisterial, let's say, or
I'm not sure.
Before.
I think it's probably in the 20th century, I would say, is when it really started completely diverging with I think with the theory of relativity and with non-determinism in general and incompleteness theory. All these things basically postulated that, first of all, there are limits to our knowledge of the physical world. So, and yet we need a kind of we can't live in a world that is incomplete in terms of our moral sort of outlook. So maybe the two should not be tied to each other, because if we do tie them, it's opening us up to complete relativism when it comes to morality, right? In physics, everything depends on the reference point of the observer. In ethics, at least the way most people want to understand it is it's not fully relativistic. There are certain truths that we believe to be true regardless of whatever situation. I mean, there are different viewpoints there, but I don't think a lot of people are trying to derive ethics from physics anymore. And maybe because also when you had the idea of physics and ethics as a combined discipline, ontology, theology, philosophy, there was this idea that, okay, let's say you start from some sort of creator, and the creator obviously is what dictates the morals and the ethics that follow, versus a world where you have completely different independent schools of thought about how the world began and how it developed, and how the morality should function, right? The two really okay, we've severed that link because we're not thinking in terms of a creator anymore. We're not thinking in terms of connecting ontology to ethics. When that happened, I don't. When did that happen? I'm not sure. I think it was a gradual process, but probably in the 20th century, it was like the final nails in that coffin were were struck. At least that's my feeling on it. But it's an interesting research question to try to tease out. Yeah, for sure.
Always like they're working with what they know, right?
Yeah.
I mean, even when you read some Jung, for example, right, and he's talking about psychic energy, he's of his time, right? Because of the time the conversation was, I think I've mentioned this before to you, right? Of the time the conversation was, it was Einstein's period, right? So they were coming up with physical energy, and of course Jung takes his mandala of the world and go, oh, okay, well, if we can have physical energy, so it's Democritus, etc., says atom, and these guys are going, So this trend of looking at physics, or the latest trends in physics, and then mapping that onto, therefore, what can we extrapolate from that?
Right. I can say one thing that, and this is because I've been studying Dante and his cosmology, and just finished doing actually another podcast on Paradisa. As late as Dante, and in general, the medieval mindset was such that everything is connected. The physical world is connected deeply with the spiritual, and one is a reflection of the other, and perhaps even an explanation of the other. So you have the book of nature and the book of the Bible, right? You have two revelations. One is the one that's in words, and the other one is like in the stars and planets and so on. And then you have ideas of deism where God is seen as kind of winding up the world's clock and then walking away essentially from the affairs of mankind. So I think that's where it starts to diverge, and you're saying, okay, well, if he walked away, then it's kind of left up to us to figure out, what's good and what's evil. We don't no longer have to use authority. We can use our own reason for that. And from that point on, philosophy, I think, starts, and ethics.
So that was the Enlightenment there, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I think, and maybe it's at that point that you have a gradual departure of this unified theory of everything, right? Just kind of like in physics, they're trying to unify all the different ways of looking at the universe into one grand theory. There was a grand theory of everything in the universe of somebody like Dante, in the universe of Plato, and in the universe of Epicurus. They all thought of the world as this one thing that is unified and operates by the same rules, whether it's the rules of physics or the rules of ethics.
So we're still looking for it.
Yeah.
Like the Holy Grail of physics. Yeah.
Yep.
Guys, hi, my name's Lisa. I just joined a few minutes ago. I really apologize for being so late. I lost track of time.
No worries, no worries. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you so much. I'm very intrigued by what you're saying, and I literally just landed in here 5 minutes ago. My camera's off because I'm in my car. It's nighttime. I'm parked, by the way. But yeah, you wouldn't be able to see me. But I'll probably just attend future meetups and come on time, hopefully.
No worries, no worries at all. Yeah, we were just going through the teaching of Epicurus and comparing his teaching to Plato, as we had been
Yeah.
going through the dialogues of Plato in the last few months, I want to say. So very interesting looking at these two thinkers and comparing them because they're so opposite in pretty much everything. And we were just trying to highlight those differences to try to understand each one and the weaknesses and or strengths in each viewpoint. DLJ pointed out that they're both wrong for right or wrong reasons. And so we're trying to tease out exactly where
right for wrong reasons,
and right for the wrong reasons too. Yes. So yeah, so super interesting.
Yeah, I was intrigued by the description, especially because I studied, I actually went to a college where I could pursue the arts, but in the one liberal arts course we were required to take freshman year, we read Plato. And I was definitely intrigued, and I got my mind all twisted up in a knot thinking through that. But I took another philosophy course because of that. That actually really twisted my mind in a knot. But because I love philosophy, and yet I feel that it was so verbal heavy, and I'm a visual thinker. I think it was very hard to comprehend. But I'm bringing this up because I actually went into studying physics in college, went from the arts into physics because of I wanted to get down to the fundamentals of the universe. And I thought, okay, I need to study the physical world to get to the bottom of things. Even though my interest was philosophical. And so I'd heard of Plato, but Epicurus I only recently encountered when someone recommended doing an Enneagram. Have you guys heard of that?
Yes.
I have not. What is that?
Yeah,
Personality, like archetypes almost, but personality.
Yes. Oh, hi. Hi, Katie. Yeah, so in the context of personality, trying to assess one's personality, yeah, so an Epicurean is one of the 9 personality types, I think.
Oh, interesting.
And when I did this, and when I did this assessment, I came out as an Epicurean, and I'm like, what does that mean? I like food?
You might as well find out, right?
You're a raging hedonist.
So Sorry.
Well, that's the misperception that most people associate with
I'm teasing.
Epicureanism. And I know, DLJ, you're tongue in cheek there, but still, I think it bears repeating that. And I first heard this. I took a class similar to you, Lisa, in college on basically like philosophy of Western civilization, where we just went through everyone, right, starting from from Thales and all the way up to Marx. So and one of the things that still stuck with me is that Epicurus, and later I think even some of the Stoics as well, maybe they developed a sort of calculus of pleasure and calculus of what it means to have a good life. And that calculus is very simple. It's about maximizing long-term pleasure. It's not just pleasure at the of the
it's not
immediate.
hedonism, right?
It's not hedonism at all. And I think Epicurus himself was known to have discouraged sexual relations of all things.
Yeah.
He did not think that that was a good way to live, to focus on that. And of course, that's the opposite of what anybody, with a kind of you call somebody an Epicurean and they're like, okay, so you're like into partying and revelries and things like that. But no, that's the opposite of what, and here's why. He wasn't ascetic. He was just saying that you get entangled in all sorts of problems with that, and therefore you will not avoid complications one way or another. And really, what you should be focusing on is on friendship. So friendship to him was the highest ideal and the highest source of pleasure, followed by the necessities of life, right? So just a very balanced, and he lived a pretty balanced and moderate life himself, and was known for his charity and his giving, not for partying. And there were some Diogenes Laertius in book 10, where he describes his life and describes his teaching. He does allude to some, I guess, slanders that circulated about him, that he in fact was the opposite of what people think. But then he says it's ludicrous, because most people do know him to be a man of high repute and an honorable person. And even in his will, which he then quotes, he left a bunch of material. He made a lot of material. What am I trying to say? Bequeath a lot of his money and substance to his friends and family and so on. So he took care of people. Yeah, so that seems to support the view that he was actually a very moderate man himself. He also, I can't see a person who wrote as much as he did, living a life of profligacy and kind of debauchery, because he wouldn't have time to write as much as he did. Supposedly he wrote over 30 volumes on all sorts of subjects. Unfortunately, he was a prolific writer. In fact, Diogenes Laertius, who obviously describes all the philosophers, all the eminent philosophers, says that nobody surpasses Epicurus as far as the amount of written material that he left after himself. However, unfortunately, we don't have, I think, hardly anything of his own writing. He's always quoted by someone else, like Diogenes Laertius in his book, or by Lucretius later in De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things. So yeah, that's a little bit about him. But if, Lisa, you mentioned you went on to study physics, so I don't know if you picked up, we were talking about earlier, his theory of atoms and how we perceive the world. Super interesting. Perhaps.
Oh, really? No, I
yes.
think you guys were wrapping up the physics part, or I didn't hear atoms mentioned, so I guess I came after that.
He definitely believed, he was a disciple of Democritus. Democritus is credited with postulating atoms, but he had a very interesting take on it. And his take was, number one, atoms are not themselves the smallest things in the world. They are composed of they're
Quarks.
indivisible. Right,
Quarks and
right.
gluons.
Yeah, as we would say, of course. But for them, it was a pretty interesting idea. And then atoms themselves come in different sizes, but these sizes are quantum sizes. So in other words, they come in
Wow,
certain, like you will not have ratios. They're only like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever.
that's amazing. He thought of a quantum before. This
Yeah.
was when?
I mean,
6,000
he
years
obviously
ago?
didn't use that
4,000?
word, but
Yeah.
the concept was there. And the reason for that was that's how he explained the variety of everything in the world. And his atoms almost sound, I want to say, they almost sound like chemical elements
Yeah.
with different numbers of protons in them, and that's how you get to different sizes. And he also said that there are finite number of atoms, the types of atoms, but the number of
Mhm.
atoms themselves is infinite, but the types are finite.
Mhm.
So that
Yeah.
was an interesting distinction he made. And then finally, the thing that intrigues me the most is his theory of how we perceive the world, which is that everything material emits or emanates these tiny, tiny, very, very thin um, lamina or filaments or not images because it's actually material, which are moving very, very fast in all directions, and
You're kidding me.
they interact directly with our senses, our organs of
Photons.
sensation. So when you
Yeah,
see
but not
something,
photon.
when you
That's
see a tree, you're interacting with that tree. You're not just seeing some kind of reflected light, like we would say today. Your eye is somehow the matter in your eye, the atoms in your eye, are interacting with um, pieces of that tree,
Oh,
the filaments of
this
that
yeah.
is
tree.
incredible.
So he
Yes,
got the photon idea right, but what he thought the photon was the bit like a particle of the tree or a particle of a
right.
related particle. Okay.
Yep.
Ah, okay.
So that's
I
more of
Yeah.
an
see.
essentialist view, which
But
is
it's
kind of
really
it's
fascinating.
kind of
Yeah.
almost.
Yeah,
Almost,
so
yes.
close.
So
Mm.
close, yes. And also, of course, because things are emitting these particles everywhere, when something goes away, let's say the source of that particle is gone, the emissions are still bouncing around. And that's how you get mixtures of things that are not real in our minds. So let's say a centaur would be a mixture of maybe emanations from a
Hmm.
horse and a man that are no
Hmm.
longer there. And so we get kind of the um, residuals of that, kind of like the Big Bang, like you get the residual radiation, the background radiation.
Wow. Yeah.
You get the residual effect of these lamina, and in your mind misinterprets it to say, oh, it's one thing. It's like a
Yeah.
horseman, and so you end up with these mythical creatures. So
Hmm.
that was his interpretation of various gods, perhaps, and things that are fantastical.
Wow. Oh my God, that's just amazing.
Yeah, yeah.
That's amazing that he saw so much. The last thing you just described is a foreign concept to me, and I don't see a direct parallel to physics at the moment. But maybe, I mean, maybe there's a mystical or psychological or uh, parallel. But that's just incredible that he had so much insight. Wow.
Yeah, and where I think when you joined, we're talking about the soul, and of course he thought the soul is also material, just made up of
Oh.
very small atoms, very fine
Huh.
atoms uh, that are moving very fast because they have to perceive and kind of the speed of thought, right? And but he conceded that since that's the case, when the body disintegrates, the soul also disintegrates because it's kind of encased in the
Mm.
body. So it's very close to our idea of, the relationship between the brain and the mind. Um, and yeah, so very interesting thinker. And very opposite of Plato. Of course, Plato is the completely opposite of all of that. Uh,
Yeah.
and thinking, of course, that the soul is eternal and is in fact a shadow or reflection of the eternal underlying fundamental
Mm.
reality. Epicurus would say, no, the fundamental reality is just these atoms flying around. That's all. That's all, folks. Uh, so, yeah.
Wow.
So yeah, we've got to give us some points.
Gotta give some points.
Right
One
for the wrong reason.
final observation, though, is this, and this is how a lot of people point out this is a weakness in his thinking. So Epicurus, from a kind of just a perspective of pragmatic, what is a good life? He thought a good life was a life of really seclusion and, in some ways, getting away from society, right? He is not a man that postulates an active political life or anything like that. The question then is, if everybody espoused this kind of lifestyle,
Yeah, there'd be
uh,
no humanity by now.
yeah, would we be still like in caves and everybody just tending to their own little hut? Um, so that's the kind of the counterpoint that Plato, of course, again, is also very opposite in that. And he and Aristotle are both very
Yeah,
much
philosopher king.
yeah, they're very much saying, political animal, right? We're the zoon politikon, political animal. That's what Aristotle, I think,
Did
called.
could I ask you something?
Yep.
Did either of these fellows because I'm thinking maybe the concept of personality or something, maybe that's a more recent idea, that maybe what you prescribe for oneself or for your type of person might not be this what you prescribe for everybody. You know, like his good life, it's a good life for him and people like him, but other people might be very different. They could have a different kind of good life, perhaps.
That's a great question, and I don't think they thought about it like that at all. I think, at least from what I can gather of Epicurus or Plato, they didn't think about that. Now, Plato, of course, makes a distinction of the four types of
Humors,
yeah,
right?
there are different types of people that, depending on, I mean, people are born into a particular essence. He doesn't call it a
Yeah.
temperament, or he wouldn't call it like a personality type. Maybe,
Yeah.
maybe he would call it a personality type. But you have like people that are like very high spirited, and they are the ones that are perfect for being the kind of the philosopher kings or whatnot. And then you have people that are born with a more kind of pragmatic mindset, and they become merchants or something like that, and so on. Uh,
Hmm.
Maybe that's the closest you get to personalities, but I'll say this: regardless of whichever station in life you are at, that just has to do with your, again, public life. In private, I think they would all say that happiness and fulfillment are universally achieved, and it's not based on your
Mhm.
specific personality type at all, because um, because being because it would mean that when you take it to its logical conclusion, if you have different types of happiness, that means that you have different types of what is good, because to them happiness was tied to what is good, and
Mhm.
you can't have multiple conceptions of what is good. Otherwise, the good thing that you're trying to conceive is actually at behind those four specific or five specific things, right? It's like, okay, what is the underlying good of those five? You have to get
Mhm.
back to one thing,
Interesting.
and therefore
Hmm.
that one thing has to be true of everyone. I want to say though, like I was
So
rereading recently.
slaves,
Yeah,
just
sure.
like
Um,
living in slave society. So did it apply to everybody?
yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know that I would. I mean, sure, sure, and again, like Stoicism probably has an answer there for slaves more than Epicureanism, because for Epicureanism, okay, how do you deal with that? Being a slave, is your life over at that point? Maybe, but I was thinking about this. So, I was rereading George Washington's second inaugural address. And in it, he says, among other things, very short address. In it, he says, one of the things that is absolutely certain is that no nation, I'm paraphrasing, no nation can be both lacking in virtue and be happy. I mean, in so many words, that's what he's saying. And this is very Platonic, because that
Hmm.
it's saying that there is no like specific recipe for one country or another country or one person or another person. It's like virtue and happiness go hand in hand. And more than that, what defines virtue is not 10 different opinions on that. It's just one thing. And we all agree on what that is, supposedly. So I think Plato would be right alongside of that, saying that you cannot have 10 different recipes for being happy, because that would mean you have 10 different conceptions of what is good. And they're mutually exclusive, right? Or they're not getting at what really is the fundamental good behind those 10 different things. So,
Hmm.
yeah.
What's the basis of the concept that there's only one good? Isn't that just an assumption?
Well, no, not really, because you can, okay, so like good is what benefits you, right? What results in your
Yeah.
flourish. And
Mm.
everything flourishes or reaches its full potential
Mm.
according to its nature.
Mhm.
So are we saying that people have different nature fundamentally? I mean, I guess
Mm.
if you answer yes, then you are saying that they're really like fundamentally different kinds of people. That's a can of worms. Um, if you say no, people are fundamentally the same, then Plato's answer would be, okay, well, if they are, then there's only really one thing, or
One
not,
good.
like fundamentally there's one way to get them to flourish. That is,
Mm.
I mean, not specific one thing, right? Obviously, everybody's in different positions and so on. But fundamentally, in a general sense, there is a path of flourishing and there's a path of the opposite, destruction, or,
Yeah.
you know.
Mm.
And
Interesting.
Epicurus actually is the same way. He doesn't say, "Oh, by the way, here are like five things. Try all of them and see which one works for you." They all are pretty much like, no, it's one thing for everybody. And for Epicurus, it's okay. You got to stay away from kind of the entanglements of politics, and you got to stay away from envy and desiring material goods, because that's the cause of strife and anger, right? And he's all
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
having a peaceful mind, right? Ataraxia,
Yeah.
peaceful mind. And so peaceful
Yeah.
mind, there's one recipe for it. Like, it might have several ingredients in it, but it's the same recipe for everyone. It's not like, oh, you're this type of person, so you get this recipe, and you're that type. And I'm not saying, by the way, that I agree with him. I'm just saying, like,
Yeah.
what I've read, it sounds like he doesn't make those distinctions. He's not nuanced like
Oh,
we are today, for better or worse.
wow. It sounds somewhat Buddhist. I'm curious what if they're if there's any
Yeah,
similarity.
there is a little bit of that. I would say, yeah, you're right. You're right. Now that I think about it, yes, because there's this little kind of like uh get rid of desire and try to desire is pain, and uh
Yeah, it sounds very much.
yeah,
Are you
yeah.
familiar with
But at
the
the same time, he
Candide?
did he did say, like, you got to enjoy life. So I don't
Are
know
you
if that's Buddhist.
are you are you familiar with the end of Candide, Voltaire's Candide?
Sorry? No.
Voltaire's Candide, right? So
Oh
you've
yeah,
got
Candide. Yeah. Uh-huh.
yeah,
Yep.
Candide is sort of sent to go around the world, and it's turning out to be a much more horrible experience.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. The best
Very
of all possible worlds. Yeah.
funny saying best of all possible world, right? But
Yeah.
the end, the Turk, who is sitting under a tree, and decides to cultivate his garden. And of course, Epicurus's thing was his jardin, his garden.
Yeah.
And there's some debate as to whether that's a Stoic response to the world, as in accepting things as they are, right? Or an Epicurean one, which is saying, okay, look, I can do what I can do within my own bounds, and I can therefore not get involved in the rest of the world, right? Which is the Epicurean version. And there's elements of Buddhism in there as well, right? So Voltaire was obviously picking up on all of those things in his
Yeah.
punchline.
Yeah, I would say it's more stoic, and here's why. The stoic ideal is centered around not pleasure, but duty.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
so, yeah, so it doesn't matter whether life is pleasant for you or not. You have to, we all have a
If you read
duty.
the ending of that book,
Yeah.
I'm gonna stay here and cultivate my garden, meaning I'm gonna
But
grow
that
fruit,
doesn't seem
for
like duty.
myself.
That seems more like I'm gonna
There's no
cultivate my
civic
garden.
duty in that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's
Really?
duty to
So,
yourself, I guess. It's like, oh, I'm gonna cultivate my duty, and like sit on my couch and watch TV.
yeah, so what I'm saying is that's well written because you can pick up
Yeah,
anything,
yeah,
including Buddhism from
yeah. No, no, for sure, for sure. Yeah, that duty seems like a pretty mild one compared to. I'm thinking of like the Roman generals or somebody like that who were like, okay, I'm gonna put my hand in fire and let it burn rather than, you know, give up my country or something like that. Yeah, but anyway.
So that was the big that I think, I mean, there was a lot in the document you sent us as well. There's a lot of, right at the beginning, it's like all the criticism, and you can just imagine that in current Twitterverse, where you've got the Stoics essentially having a go, oh, this is outrageous behavior, these Epicureans, right? And probably the other way around, right? So there's a lot of sledging, as the Australians would say, so criticism of each
Right,
other.
right.
And it's because of this main contrast, right? So you've got the Epicureans who say, look, I'm going to cultivate my own garden, have my own friends, and all that kind of stuff, right? The Stoics saying, hang on, no, civic duty, because what do you Epicureans do when the barbarians are at the gate?
Right.
It's going to be
Right.
run over, right? So you've got to have some sort of society.
Yeah.
And Epicureans are sort of opting out from that society. So it always makes me think of the individualist libertarian. Is it prepper? The people who go into the woods.
Preppers, yes, that's very popular in the United States.
Prepare for the end of the world kind of thing.
Yes.
So that's like an extreme version, I think, therefore, of the Epicurean view,
Yes,
right?
preppers,
As opposed to, let's see if we can do something about society, which is what the Stoics are.
Right. Well, the preppers, yeah, they're definitely more interested in their own little garden than preserving society. Yeah, for sure. Let me, before we part tonight, I don't know if I included this link in the original meetup. This is a really excellent summation of Epicurus's teaching. And this is what I used for tonight's outline. So if you read this and maybe follow up with Diogenes Laertius, I think you will get a really good feel for Epicurus's teaching. And then it has all sorts of references there at the end there as well.
Thank you.
That's American. I'm going to have to go with Britannica every time. So
I don't know if it's American. It's Stanford, but I'm sure they used a lot of people from all over the world. So, but yes, you might want to use Oxford. I don't know if Oxford actually.
I was saying in the beginning, because when I discovered Epicurus, I was about 8, and I was reading through the
Britannica entry,
and they had a misquote. In other words, the Odyssey thing about why call him God, was attributed to Epicurus at that time. So maybe Stanford.
Yeah. No, this by the way, this is an excellent portal for philosophy in general. It's not just about Plato, by the way. I know it says Plato, probably because Plato is like considered the most famous philosopher ever. But it is a great resource for really any philosophical teaching or a particular philosopher's life. Really excellent resource. Highly recommend. So, all right. I think we did justice to Epicurus tonight. What do you guys think?
I'll bet you did.
All right. Katie agrees. That's all I want. It's just affirmation from Katie. That's it. I'm happy. All right. Sounds good. Well, this is getting recorded, so if you missed something, feel free to go back and listen to this. This will get published shortly. I'll send the info to Shrikant and he'll publish it. Yeah, and so next time we're probably going to continue with Platonic dialogue. I might summarize some of what we discussed tonight, just because there were fewer people than I was hoping for. But anyway, thank you again for coming, joining in the discussion, and we will see you next month.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Good to meet you all. Bye.